In every Hollywood depiction of the societal collapse, one of the quintessential characters is a maniacal and unruly mob of people. The hordes of the unprepared scrambling to make sense of their newfound freedom in a lawless world. This is a plot that has not only been found in fiction, but has time and time again been demonstrated throughout human history in real-life events. After a major disaster, or during the gradual decline of social institutions that would be brought by economic or political turmoil, there will be large amounts of unprepared and deviant individuals saturating the streets, for reasons which are anything but good. And this is because the majority of people would not self-describe as preppers. To them, preparedness is merely buying home insurance, life insurance, car insurance, but nothing else. And it's safe to say that if it went down today, 90% of people would find themselves in some sort of mob, trying to survive. These mobs, or hordes as they're often referred to in prepping circles, could have many different motivations, and we'll talk about those later in this video. Some may be evacuating what were once safe havens, refugees dejected into the fray of a lawless world, roaming from place to place seeking only security, but being met with resistance by those who up until that point in time were very secure. Some are just scavengers, feeding off the remains of a dying world, while others capitalize on the unrest as an outlet for mischief and the expression of their deepest, darkest desires. The Golden Horde, as it's colloquially called in prepping circles, is a mad scramble by every unprepared man, woman, and child to procure the last morsels of sustenance. From street to street, from house to house, ravaging, defiling, and destroying everything in their wake like a biblical swarm of locusts. Fires, screams, gunshots, sirens, windows breaking, dogs barking, as a raging crowd thunders through the streets like startled buffalo recklessly stampeding through the savannah in search of safety and sustenance. This is the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde was originally a term used to describe a Mongolian tribe, but in the context of preparedness, it's meant to refer to anyone who is unprepared. You see, the prepper's greatest fear is typically not catastrophic events themselves, rather, the hordes of those who didn't prepare. To some people, this may seem like a paranoid delusion. However, it can also be viewed as a sign of long-term thinking, as a sign of seeing many moves ahead, because ultimately, if you're lucky enough to survive a major disaster of that magnitude, your biggest challenge will be dealing with the fallout. These hordes of unprepared people will be a defining feature of the acute phase of any major disaster event, because 90% of people are not prepared to endure them. Crowds are emotional, they're impulsive, they're intolerant, and unreasonable, and for this reason should be avoided at all costs. All of those zombie movies are just a metaphor for the Golden Horde. In fact, there even is a movie called La Horde, which has a gang of criminals who are forced to pair up with some law enforcement officers to fight off hordes of the undead. You see, just like zombies, a mob of people is reduced to the most primal instinct to feed, irrespective of any moral or ethical deviations. We associate civilization with rules, rationality, and the frontal cortex of the brain, while crowds are invariably regressive, uncreative, and ultimately destructive, driven by the impulses of their brainstems and limbic systems. Individuals can be geniuses or dullards, but crowds can only ever be dullards, and can only ever be righteous if guided by a benevolent dictator. There are 4 types of mobs recognized in crowd psychology. The first kind of mob is an aggressive mob. These are violent and outwardly focused mobs. Example of these would be football riots, hooliganism, or something like the LA riots, and even some of the riots in 2020 and early 2021. The impetus for these types of events can range from things of great political importance to something as insignificant as a lost football game. These aggressive mobs are usually spawned by the second type of mob, which is an expressive mob. This is any large group of people who are conglomerating for an active purpose. This could be civil disobedience, to watch a sports game or a rock concert, maybe to partake in some sort of religious activity. For the most part, these crowds usually have some sort of common purpose, and they have their attention held by some central figure or idea which is occupying their attention. But they can quickly morph into an aggressive mob if the conditions are right. A great example of this is a mosh pit. The majority of the crowd is not in a mosh pit, but there is that one small sect of the crowd which devolves into this sadomasochistic orgy of thrashing violence. Escapist mobs are characterized by a large number of panicked people who are trying to escape a dangerous situation. For example, people who are trying to evacuate from a city that's being consumed by wildfire, or a crowd of people who are trying to escape an active shooter scenario. Maybe it's a crowd of people scrambling for a place of safety when the nuclear sirens go off, or even a crowd stampeding over one another trying to escape a building for whatever reason, something that we've unfortunately seen recently in early November of 2021. There's also acquisitive mobs. These are the type of mobs that are going to be present in the earliest phases of societal collapse. This is when large numbers of people are fighting over limited resources. This is the most common type of mob depicted in apocalyptic fiction. Crowds of people storming the grocery stores, fighting over food. This is best exemplified by the mobs of Black Friday shoppers. And if people would do that for things they don't need, imagine what they would do for things that they actually need. Gustav Labon was one of the pioneers of crowd psychology. He wrote a book in the late 1900s called The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. And even though it was written well over 100 years ago, its ideas, although not perfect, are still extremely validated by the events in our modern day. He has the idea that crowds exist in three main stages: submergence, contagion, and suggestion. In the submergence or anonymity phase, people lose all their sense of individuality. Think about it. Most people describe themselves through cultural novelties, like your favorite sports team, your rock band, your favorite this, your favorite that, your favorite TV show. All of these things cease to exist as society starts to collapse. And when these things cease to exist, a big part of your identity also ceases to exist. What remains, however, is the will to survive. Now, in the contagion phase of a mob, so aptly termed, this is where people start to sacrifice their own personal interest for the collective interest. This is where people start to conform to what the person next to them is doing. And this is when true swarm herd mentality starts to kick in. I was recently watching a Just for Laugh gag, which is one of the longest running prank shows which is done here in Canada. And they did a prank where a guy dressed in a military uniform, looking like a drill sergeant, goes up to a line of people, 5 people standing in line. 4 of them are actors, 1 of them isn't an actor. And he goes up to them and says, "Attention!" All 4 of the actors immediately stand at attention and issue a salute. The one person who wasn't an actor, due to the pressure of conformity, also salutes this person who they have no idea who they are. They have no idea if they're a real military officer. This just demonstrates the power of conformity, which has been replicated in numerous social psychological experiments. The next phase is suggestibility. This is where once your individuality has been forfeited to the crowd, and once the conformity contagion has permeated the mob, you are now highly suggestible to the bidding of any charismatic leader, and you can be made to do things that run counter to your best interests. This is where people become highly susceptible to demagogues and cult leaders. In this phase, people are almost wholly at the whim of external factors for guiding their own behavior. Sigmund Freud thought that when people were in these types of mobs and crowds, their moral compass simply ceases to function, that which he referred to as the superego. That part of your mind that says you shouldn't do this and you should do this simply stops working properly, and you start acting solely out of self-interest. While there have been some psychological theorists who have challenged Labon's theories about the degeneracy of crowds and mob rule, there are some rare circumstances where being passionate in a crowd can bring forth positive social change. But this is solely reliant on whether or not the person controlling the mob has intentions that are ethical. Now the question is, as preppers, how do we prepare for the Golden Horde? How do we survive the mobs? Everything you learn and acquire throughout your preparedness journey is going to help you to mitigate the threat of these unruly crowds. But one of the first things we must accept is that you must know when to evacuate. Unless you have a very capable neighborhood watch group with sizable manpower and resources, an unruly mob is not going to be quelled by you and your 12 gauge. Now, in the acute phase of collapse, most of these ravenous mobs are going to pass up a hard target when there's an easier one available. But if there is no easy target, then you indeed will become the target. And as you were to descend deeper and deeper into an economic collapse scenario, this is when the mobs will be forced to become more and more brazen, especially if their only means of sustenance is raiding and pillaging. If you are a woman, you should make yourself look less feminine. Hide your hair in a hat. Don't wear provocative clothing. Make yourself as unappealing and uninteresting to predators as possible. This may even require you to do something drastic, like shaving your head, or wearing clothing that conceals your feminine features. And I apologize if I offend anybody's politically correct sensitivities, but human beings, when being driven by their most unpleasant instincts and primal urges, will certainly not yield to your sensitivities. This follows the strategy of being the gray man. You may have to be the mob. You want to try to blend in as best as possible, and that may mean holding up flags that you don't necessarily believe in order to get yourself out of a situation. Don't be the only guy tacked out in military gear when you're surrounded by a mob of people with wife beaters and jeans. If possible, always stay on the periphery and always have an exit point. Keep your family and friends as close as possible. All it takes is a second for someone to be accosted or violently assaulted. Another thing to be mindful of, if you are on the defensive of an attacking mob, look for the instigators and the influencers. The majority of people in these mobs are followers. They're not the people who are dictating the direction of the swarm. You need to find the primary influencers and either neutralize them or avoid them. Everybody that falls underneath them in rank will be less likely to escalate after the leader has been neutralized. And lastly, don't be a hero, but don't lose your humanity. The fact is, in these situations, well-meaning people are going to have to choose their battles. There are going to be some situations where you desperately want to help people, but they are entirely beyond your control, and you're going to put yourself and other people in even greater jeopardy. At the same time, you don't want to lose your humanity. You also want to be a part of the solution by helping whoever you can, because indeed, you may be the one that needs help. It'll be up to you in a moment's notice to decide whether your reluctance to help someone is rooted in your own motivation to simply save yourself at all costs, or whether or not helping or saving somebody is futile and will only bring undue harm to you and your family. These will be hard decisions to make. Let me know what sort of criteria you would have for helping somebody in one of these violent mob type scenarios. What are you willing to put on the line to help somebody out in one of these situations? Are you willing to lose your own life and potentially leave your family without a protector in order to potentially save somebody else's life? And also, be sure to let me know your thoughts on mob psychology in the comments section below. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Canadian Prepper out.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.